Brilliant. So today I want to take you through a little bit of background as to why carbon storage is important and why we study it in our tiny forests. We're going to talk to you about how you measure it. So those of you who've taken part, this will be a bit of background to what you've already done and an introduction to those who haven't taken part yet. And then Sophie's going to talk about the actual calculations of carbon storage and how we go about that and share some of the results from Carbon Week. And we want to move on to what's coming next for the Tiny Forest Programme, but also an opportunity to discuss some of the challenges that people face monitoring tiny forests, and particularly in relation to trees and tags and all things related to this particular survey. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sophie.
So we're here about carbon in terms of, well, trees primarily in tiny forests, but the survey that you'll have taken during Carbon Week focuses on carbon and measuring how much carbon is stored in the above ground biomass of the trees and shrubs that are in tiny forest. So ultimately it's probably quite useful for you to understand how the carbon got there in the first place and how carbon is stored in plants and generally in the world. I think it's quite useful. So the amount of, if you think about the globe, Earth, including the atmosphere around it, the actual amount of carbon in that space doesn't change. The amount stays the same. It's just where it's stored and what it's associated with kind of fluxes and changes over time. So you might have heard of something probably when you're in school, unless you happen to also work in that area, known as the carbon cycle. Carbon cycle can cycle through the atmosphere, living biomass such as plants, algae. Don't forget about the algae, it's very important in the ocean. Also is present in water systems, in the soil, in lots of different spheres, and it cycles around these through sort of biological and weather processes as part of them. But specifically relating to plants, because I'm not a geologist, the main way that carbon comes into plants is through photosynthesis. So all plants have these tiny little microscopic holes on their leaves that are like little mouths. They open and close like this. They're called stomata. And when they're open, they generally during the day, they let air, which contains CO2 from the atmosphere, inside the plant, and that CO2 is basically used in the photosynthesis to create starch. So that's what sort of gets locked. The carbon from photosynthesis gets locked up into the living tissues. So as you see here on this picture, on the right hand side says plants use CO2 from the air and water to build carbohydrates. It's like literally building their living biomass. And then what they let back out of those holes is oxygen and water. So they're great for the atmosphere because they pull carbon down and then lock it in their living tissues. There's also other processes where this carbon can move into the roots in the soil and also be present in the soil around it. This is something that we're exploring through research collaborations in tiny forests. But what you've been measuring is the carbon that is stored through photosynthesis in that above ground biomass. It can long term then be released, this carbon can be released back into the atmosphere when plants die and they decompose. But that's the latter half of the cycle. What we're focusing on right now is how it's being stored, which is essentially from the air into the living tissues of the plant through photosynthesis. And this is really important. What measuring this is really important for a different number of different reasons. So I think everybody here, I'm preaching to the choir, is aware of the fact that we're in a climate crisis. Atmospheric carbon has increased in concentration by 50% since pre-industrial revolution. So around the Industrial Revolution, it was around 278 parts per million. The recent NASA surveying 2 years ago was 419, and you can download that data. It just goes up and up every year. So it's really important that we're like as the sort of global we're in charge of the globe, we're looking after it, we need to work out ways of starting to reduce this atmospheric carbon concentration. One of those ways is through something called nature-based solutions, which is maximizing this drawdown of atmospheric carbon using photosynthetic processes. So actually, the largest amount of carbon stored on land is stored in forests. So nearly 50% of land-based carbon is actually present in forests. imagine if we increased those forests and restored them, how much more carbon we'd be able to draw down. Because ultimately, increased atmospheric carbon equals a worsening biodiversity, a worsening global carbon crisis. But recent research has suggested that we have all the rural reforestation projects, but actually improving urban reforestation, like we're doing through tiny forests, can actually offset greater than 25% of the carbon emissions produced within cities. So it's really important for a number of different reasons, let alone biodiversity and welfare.
Thanks, Sophie. So most of you who've been involved in the carbon surveys will know how we measure it, but I do just want to go through some of the sort of principles behind how we design the surveys, because obviously you can measure trees in all sorts of different ways. So as Sophie said, we're measuring the above ground biomass, and we do that by measuring how the trees are growing, essentially. So this gives us data on understanding all sorts of parameters around the forest about how different species grow, how different species interact with each other, and how they by planting in this particular way, tiny forests are planted using this Miyawaki method, where we plant very densely. We also mix a really diverse range of species, shrubs and trees. So this is giving us loads of data on how trees and shrubs behave in these environments. And we can look at that across our now 208 tiny forests across the country, gives us a great range of situations and conditions to see how we can optimize this method. But first of all, how do we do this? How do we go about doing this with citizen scientists? We can't go around all the forests ourselves measuring the trees. So we take a sample approach, and you'll all be familiar with the tags, those of you involved in tiny forests altogether. So on a planting day, we take the tags that are numbered 1 to 100, and we are aiming to put these on a sample of 100 trees, 100 of the 600 trees that are in the forest, to represent the number and diversity of species present in each forest. So if we just asked you to go in and measure some trees in your forest, some people would always measure all the big trees, or some people would always measure all the small trees, or choose the most exciting looking tree to measure. By doing this, by tagging individual trees, we are making sure that we have a random sample, but also that it represents the diversity of species and the number of each of those species present in the forest. It also allows us to follow the lifetime of an individual tree, see how it grows and changes over time. So we're seeking to have a random sample of little blue dots across your tiny forest to represent trees in the center, trees on the edge, and all the different species that are present. And this is what a tag will look like. The reason we have a metal disc like this is that when the trees are old enough, so when their diameter is over, the tree trunk diameter is over 15 centimeters, I think that's right, Sophie, we can actually attach the tag in a more traditional tree tagging process, where we actually be able to attach the tag directly to the trunk. So you're seeing tags like that around parks and gardens that you might go to, allowing people to survey trees their lifetime. And once you've got your tagged numbers, these are all set up on our citizen science portal, and it allows you to put the number in, and you can find out information about that tree. You can find out what species it is, and learn a little bit that way as well. We did this on purpose to really facilitate people being able to take part in the survey at any point when they turn up in a forest. So we put the tags on the trees on planting day to ensure they're on the right species, and then it also means when someone comes to the forest, they can take part straight away. So as you know, you'll measure the height, and we measure the diameter of the tree trunks in order to estimate the volume of tree above the ground. And hopefully most of you are familiar with that process. So once you've done that, and once we've got our random sample from across the forest, we get all the numbers back. And some of you may have downloaded the data yourselves and had a look at it. But we also are in the process right now of analysing all the data that's come in over this year. So Sophie's going to take you through the steps we take to actually convert the measurements you take into estimates of carbon storage.
Yeah, so I thought it'd be useful for you to understand how we actually calculate carbon storage, because what you're measuring is height and width of a tree. So how on earth do we get to the point where we calculate how much carbon is stored in the above ground? Well, some handy entrepreneurial foresters have done this for us already. So understanding carbon stored in the above ground biomass of a tree, obviously you can't go around chopping down trees and weighing them, or removing them from the ground and weighing them. So some clever sort of forestry research teams have come up with some quite simple calculations that basically mean that we can take the sort of diameters and height above ground of a tree, which approximately measures its volume essentially, and from that we can come out with an approximate amount of carbon. So as Daniel said, you measure the tree height and the tree diameter. There's a lot of, next step is we calculate what's known as green weight. So there's actually a lot, and we say green weight because it's the, when you scratch the bark back, the trees are green. And this is because living trees contain a lot of water. So we're calculating green weight, which incorporates the approximate amount of water that's still living within those tissues of living trees that contain a lot of moisture. So that's our first step. And we calculate green weight as the C subscript GW, that's a constant. So that's just a mathematical term that researchers have established is necessary when going through this process. I think in this case it's 0.05. It's just a number that is there that is used to make sure this happens appropriately. And then that constant is multiplied by the diameter squared that you've measured, and then multiplied by the height that you've measured. The next, so again, really quite simple. So then we take that, whatever number we come out with for green weight, and then we feed it into calculating the dry weight. So these researchers that have gone through this process previously, who've come up with this calculation, know that essentially when you chop down a tree, weigh it for its green weight, and then dry it, approximately half of the green weight is actually water. So all we do is we take the green weight and we halve it, which in this case, we do that by timesing by 0.5, so 50%, 0.5. So very simple. And then next, when we calculate carbon storage, again, it has been shown that approximately half of the dry weight of a tree is actually carbon, which is a really large amount. And it's really important because all of those tissues within plants that are made from something called cellulose, the backbone of all of that living structure is basically got a backbone of carbon. So it's a really large amount. So here we just calculate the green weight, which is the weight of the tree with water present, and we half it to get the dry weight, essentially what it is with the water taken out. And then all we do is half it once more with the dry weight, and that gives us the approximate amount of carbon that's present in the tree. So we do that for each one of the trees that you've measured that has a tag. There is a way of doing this that's species specific. We're not doing that right now, but with something we might explore in the future where we do that with a species specific constant. But for now, it's giving us a general ballpark. And then when we calculate the total amount that's present in the forest, we take all the trees that you've measured for the carbon content. So say if you've measured all 100 tagged trees in a forest, we'll take all of those individual measurements, add them together, divide them by 100 to get the mean carbon content for the trees measured in the forest, and then we times that by 100 to represent an overall presence of every single individual in the forest, and that gives us our carbon content for an entire tiny forest. So it's actually quite straightforward. I hope the way I explained it was straightforward anyway. So coming on to the results, so Carbon Week I think ranged from 16th to the 24th of September. I was actually out at a science day in Knowlegate during that week. Christian, who's on the call, he was there at Knowlegate, getting in there and measuring lots and lots of tags at the site, which that site has, I think, 400 trees, 400 tags, I think, something like that. So we're just hoping that, yeah, so we're just we'll give you the results just for Carbon Week. We are in the process of analysing all the carbon data for all of our tiny forests across all of our years, but the results that you're seeing here is just for what was measured in that 1 week in September this year. So during that week across the country, we managed to get 1,116 surveys, which I think is amazing. So many people giving, like, caring and measuring this thing over just 7 days, and that's happened over 27 tiny forests. within that week, 42 different shrub and tree species were measured. We are now aware that the height of the trees is starting to become a problem. In some of our older forests, they're getting quite tall and too tall to actually measure. So when you'll notice when you're doing the carbon content survey, there is an option for, is the tree too tall? We actually had 12 trees that were too tall to be measured. And these particular species were alder, aspen, elder, 2 different types of birches, and an ear willow. And what we actually saw across these species, that's quite interesting, because most of these species are what we call pioneer species. They're species that we know grow very quickly. So again, that's informative. This data is informative to us because we are seeing that in our data. The 12 of the trees that were too tall to measure were most of them were actually our pioneer species. The
just to add, Sophie, is that now the challenge for us to come up with is the method, the appropriate method, the feasible method for you guys as citizen scientists to measure trees that are above your arm's reach. So we are definitely coming to this, and watch this space.
Yeah, it is a challenge that we'll be looking at over the winter, of how we manage to kind of roll out a new method for you to measure trees that are too tall. So of the tiny forests that we measured, some of them are 4 years old. Some of them are only 1 year old. So we get quite a big span in terms of the size of the trees that were measured. But just out of interest for you, our tallest tree was 315 centimeters. They must have had a ladder, because that is very tall. And that was an ear willow species in Barry. And our smallest tree was just a little weeny 31 centimetre English oak in Peckham Rye. So the Peckham Rye site is 1 year old, and the Barry site is 4 years old. So that goes to show how much they grow in that time.
Okay. Sorry.
On to the next slide.
Yep.
Yep. So of course, what we're interested in is growth dynamics are really interesting, and there's lots of things we can do ourselves and will do in tiny forests, is exploring not just carbon, but also how different tree species grow. But ultimately what we're here for is how much carbon have they stored. So within Carbon Week alone, so the data that was collected, those 27 tiny forests, drum roll, reveal it, Daniel. Yeah, those 27 tiny forests, which are listed on the left of this graph here, they were found to have 622.5 kilos of carbon present within them. So I appreciate you might, please don't be demoralized if you think that sounds like a small number. These forests are quite young, and 2, they are very little. And 3, there's only 27 of them. So we are aware that tiny forests are not the answer to the global carbon crisis, but they are a contributing factor in making meaningful change. These small spaces can ultimately sort of contribute together to make overall a relatively big difference. If you put together, at the moment, we've got 200 tiny forests. It can start to add up, and every little helps. And as you saw from that paper that I suggested earlier, well, if we start planting tiny forests in every city, it can start making a meaningful change to how to sort of offsetting carbon emissions within a city. So no, it's not going to solve the world's problems, but there is no single thing that will. We need to make these small contributing factors. So this graph, anyway, I digress. This graph you can see here on the left are the tiny forests, and they're coloured based on the age of the forest. So which you can see on the bottom right, which we'd hope to see that more carbon is stored in forests as they grow. And as you can see here, the very top bar, which is the site in Barry, is our only site that's 4 years old. And that site has over 100 kilos of carbon stored within it. And that's just for that 1 week that we measured. And what we can see here is a kind of really nice and quite exponential curve as the forests are getting older. They seem to be growing a little bit faster and storing more and more carbon, which is what we'd expect to see. So one of the things, sorry.
No, go on, Sophie.
No, so I was rolling on to the next slide, so please do.
Okay, I wanted to have a look at, because obviously we've got someone from Peckham Rye here. There's north and south. sites that have been monitored, and they're in their first growing season, but they're up there with some of those that are in their second growing season. So you can begin to see there's quite a lot of variation across sites, even within a growing season. I think that's quite interesting for us to explore what the factors might be that are influencing some of those differences in the rates of growth. And also in relation to what Sophie was saying earlier about the extent of the impact of tiny forests, one of the other things that we will be able to report on over time is how the rate at which carbon is stored in a tiny forest compared to other types of green infrastructure, be it other tree planting methods or other land uses in cities. So if ultimately we find the carbon is stored faster in a tiny forest, then we're making a greater impact than other uses of this land might be. So that's one of the reasons why, if you see at the bottom of the graph, there are two sites, one from Derbyshire, where Kieran is representing today, the Knowlegates Farm site. We have a Miyawaki planted site and we have a conventionally planted site with trees spaced out in a much more conventional, traditional manner. And we're going to be able to use those two sites really to compare the rate of growth and the rate of carbon storage over time.
Yeah, some of our research outputs that we aim long-term to address as part of the tiny forest. Obviously, tiny forest is a form of Miyawaki forest. You'll often see, if you Google Miyawaki forests and the benefits that they have, you'll often see this number that Miyawaki forests sequester 30 times more carbon than something else. It varies what it's compared to, a grassland, another forest, things like that. Take that number with a pinch of salt. There is no formal research evidence to support that claim, and it's part of the reason why this research and the data that you're collecting is so important, because this number has been thrown around, which is essentially could be false news, or it could be real, but we need this data to be able to explore how Miyawaki style forests sequester carbon, whether it is 30 times more. I think that's due down to the density of planting. Somebody's scaled it up essentially, or whether it's less, or how much it is, and how and where that can be used meaningfully as a nature-based solution. So, we are intending to use the data that you collect here to try and inform on research questions such as that, which long-term might inform into policy such as green infrastructure policy. So, small actions can have big consequences.
Can I ask a quick question if that's okay?
Sure.
It was just about that graph, because you said about, you can look at different tiny forests have like different amount of like sequestered carbon or carbon storage. Mm-hmm. Is that assuming that all the different forests are like roughly the same size, or is you like considering that there's different like plot areas or different quantity of trees? Like, is it all per tree or is it per forest, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so all apart from Knowlegate, which is the one that you've come to, Christian, all the rest of our tiny forests are exactly the same area. Okay. So Knowlegate is one that we will need to, I kind of left it in here, but I potentially shouldn't have done, because it is obviously a much larger site, or I should have divided it by 3. But all our other tiny forests are actually 200 meters squared. So they are kind of comparable, and they all have 600 trees in them, with certain species representing certain proportions of the canopy. So they should be essentially what we'd refer to as a living laboratory. They are essentially sort of a standardized methodology, which means that we can directly compare them. Obviously, they're going to experience, in terms of, like you're saying, in terms of number of trees, area, which is a great question, by the way. So it's one of the reasons why we have these sites, because they act as living laboratories, and it then allows us to explore what factors cause variation. So, for example, like, are the sites number 1 here that have grown much faster and are up there with 2 growing seasons, are they further down south where they get some more sun and longer days? These sorts of questions we'll be able to explore, of like, what are the driving factors that might affect forest growth. So it's super interesting for that reason. Knowlegate is a bit of a one-off. So those who don't know, Knowlegate that Christian came to, it's 3 tiny forests together. So it's 3 times the size, and then it's flanked by normal planting style. So it's a dedicated research site.
Yeah, I answered that really well. Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks.
Great question. Right. Can I jump to the next one? So, Sophie, if it's still on you.
Yeah. So obviously it's interesting for us. We're interested in how much carbon is overall stored, but it is also really interesting because different trees grow at different rates. One of the reasons we like to measure tiny forest from what we call early growth, so these small whips, all the way through to, ideally, if we keep the project going that long enough, is maturity for these trees, is because trees don't grow at a linear rate. They will sort of grow at different rates. So we know pioneer species grow faster. And it's also quite interesting that different species might store different amounts of carbon. So we like to also track what's happening at the species level. So just to have a look, so far within our results from Carbon Week, which species are we finding that store the most carbon? So we've got all the species that we've measured here along the x-axis, along the bottom. And then I've kind of stacked, this is the total carbon count, like that's stored, labeled under each species. So this is putting together all the data from all the different tiny forests, and this is the total contribution from that species. So this is going to vary a little bit because we've got different growing seasons associated with that species. So the highest amount of carbon we have stored is actually in wild cherry, which is that big bar there. Which has 362 kilos of carbon stored in that species across all forests. As you can see, that light green bar, there's a really big contribution from the oldest tiny forest to that particular species. So it kind of will depend to some extent how much, but we're seeing here wild cherry is kind of storing the most amount of carbon. I've seen that it's probably associated with the fact it also tends to be one of our tallest species as well. So I think it is, it probably overall is storing some of the most amount of carbon because it grows quite fast. Our next big hitters, we've got grey willow, which is 168, and we again would kind of expect that because grey willow is a pioneer species, so it's going to grow really fast and have a bigger above ground biomass at this early stage. All that data comes from a year 2 forest. And then we've got hawthorn, which I thought was quite interesting because hawthorns I didn't think have hawthorn down as a big hitter. They can be relatively small trees sometimes, but yeah, hawthorn we're finding actually contributes the most. And again, especially maybe it might grow slowly. You can see here the data in years 1 and 2 is quite small, but then there's the carbon from year 1 and 2 is quite small, but there's a lot in year 3. So maybe it really ramps up its growth in year 3. And then after that, we have alder, which again, I would expect alder to be one of our species that stores most amount of carbon because it is a pioneer species and it does grow particularly fast. So it's quite interesting for us in terms of, okay, what is growing the fastest in the tiny forest early stage, and what point does the things start growing faster and storing more carbon? So yeah, but overall, wild cherry's winning by a long mile.
Thanks, Sophie. So, you might now be thinking, those of you particularly who encountered some problems, this is all very well if you're able to actually take part in the survey. So those of you that experienced some problems, we wanted to acknowledge, this is one of our biggest forests, this is our oldest forest, Witney in Oxfordshire. It was planted in the March of 2020, so it's had 4 growing seasons. You can see it's pretty impressive. And I'm having a look there. What if I can't find any tags? Now, I think lost tags is probably the biggest problem that people experience, and I'm sure that there are others. And as I say, we may have a little bit of time today to discuss, but otherwise we are seeking to open up some of this discussion and share some of our thoughts with you about some of the solutions. So mainly, we wanted to acknowledge, that there are challenges that people face in monitoring trees and frustration associated with that. And wanted to assure you that we're thinking and working hard on it. We're trying to think of the best solution, given what I laid out at the start about the aims and the reason why we've set up the system as we have. You can imagine that there's no simple single solution to the problem. We're trying some different things this year with some different materials for attaching the tags to the new forests. Some forests where we've re-tagged, where a large number of the tags have been lost. So we're doing all we can. But there are other issues as well that people have reported to us in terms of if tags potentially, sorry, jumping a slide. When tags have been lost, obviously, or stolen, we've also found that tags can get too tight on the trees if the forest isn't monitored or measured, maintained very well. If it's a forest you visited and there isn't an active tree keeper group, we find that some of the trees have outgrown their tags, and the tag is tight around the tree. So these are all things we want to avoid, and we're working harder in the early years with tree keepers and other volunteers to try to make sure that we're loosening tags where appropriate, moving them up onto branches, and also keeping a track of how the tags are doing and are we losing too many of them. And as I say, the sort of third thing that we're encountering is that trees are now getting too tall to measure using the method that we have established. And we obviously knew that time would come. It's come quickly. Everyone says Miyawaki forests grow fast, and they really do. So we are working on some methods. One might be an analytical approach where we can actually calculate and estimate the height from the diameter that participants measure, but also other sort of technologies using measuring apps on phones, extendable poles, all sorts of other things that would allow people to potentially measure these really much taller trees, because that's going to be really fascinating to see over time. So watch this space, keep coming to us with ideas and thoughts, and as I say, we hopefully we'll be putting out an invitation soon to join us for a session to discuss some of these options and think about both the feasibility, the accuracy of the measurements, and the changes that would be required to our systems and to the portal to make that happen. So none of these things are negligible. They're all kind of big decisions to make, and we want to make the right decision. We don't want to be changing things around too long.
And yeah, if I can just add on to that, Daniel, if there are some of these things are ideas that need trialing. So if you're somebody associated with a tiny forest on here that is particularly keen and has some time, or you're part of a keen group, maybe contact Divya or let us know whether you would be interested in actually piloting some of these trial ideas for us, because we are aware that finding both losing tags but also finding tags within these jungles can be a complete nightmare for yourselves. So we are trialing some sort of really different monitoring ideas, such as doing transects and quadrats and other things around what is working, isn't working. So if you are on here, you do have time, you're excited potentially to dedicate some of that time towards piloting experimental methods for us, please let us know.
Great, because this is something that these data, the thing that Sophie was saying about the calculations and the way that we can estimate carbon based on data. Lots of these data come from just mature forests. So really some of the problems we're trying to tackle here on measuring young and rapidly growing forests are new problems. They are things that the ecology and community forests have not dealt with before. So we are breaking new ground, trying to find ways to answer these questions that are really interesting to us. So I will move on, so we have time for a little bit of discussion. Just to let you know what's next. So we are in the process of crunching all the numbers from this monitoring season, as Sophie said. The data from Carbon Week will obviously feed into that, and we'll have data from a wider range of forests and more trees and more species represented to update the data that we've presented to you here today. We will be hopefully releasing that monitoring report in January 2024. So keep your eyes open for that. The other thing Sophie mentioned is we are working with researchers in the UK and beyond. We've recently, in this last year, formally established the Miyawaki Research Network, which we lead. And we're working with research institutes and students setting up. We're just advertising at the moment 3 potential PhD studentships working on the Tiny Forest program in various elements. So there's lots of sort of other research activities going on where we will be linking up the citizen science data with other research based data, more in-depth studies of some elements that can't be captured through citizen science. And as I've mentioned, we're developing our tree tagging and measuring methods and analysis to try to always seek to improve our processes and our approaches, and working with you guys to help us do that best. And then just keep an eye out. We have I believe 60 tiny forests due to go in the ground this season. So keep an eye out. The planting dates aren't on yet, but look in your area if you fancy getting involved in a new forest, or you know your family, friends who live somewhere where there are tiny forests being planted. Please do spread the word and get them along to planting day, and hopefully sign them up as tree keepers too. There'll be more webinars like this one, another training webinar on tree keeper induction for new tree keepers for new forests this season, and then a really interesting one towards the end of November, how to engage your local council via the tiny forest, to get the council involved in some of thinking about the principles that we talk about in tiny forest, the environmental solutions that a forest can bring, and use it as a platform to talk about some of the concerns or interests you might have in your environment and what the council could do about that. So finally, I'll open up to questions. The link here on the chat, I'll put it in the chat as well, is for our Eventbrite channel, where all of the webinars, but also all of the planting days and other activities are shared. So hopefully you've got that bookmarked and you keep an eye on it in future. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to end the slideshow and pop that into that link into the chat.
Thanks all. If anybody has any questions, please either shout out, raise your hand, whatever mode takes your fancy. Or put it in the chat if you're too shy.
I think Alex has got a hand up.
Well, thanks. First, I'll say that was really interesting. I was pleased to see how much carbon the actual trees have already stored. It's impressed me how much they've done. Also, it's really interesting to see, like, especially like in the third year, how the forest, how much more it really goes up in terms of how much they can actually store in just like 1 year, which that impressed me quite a lot. I was going to ask one thing I was a little bit confused on. With the actual total carbon storage you have for each tiny forest, is that based on just, or is that like the total carbon storage for the trees that have been tags that have been measured for each forest, or is it the actual total based on like the estimate, like extrapolating the data from the trees already measured?
Sophie, do you want to?
So no, we're not extrapolating. Yeah,
we're extrapolating
we're not
to the forest level from the trees. Yeah.
Right, I see. That's cool. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So that's where I think Sophie was saying you could do that at a species level. So at the moment we use a common constant across the species, but we know species store different amounts of carbon, grow at different rates, and our forests are all composed of different combinations of species.
Yeah.
So that would definitely improve our estimates if we can bring that element in. As I say, as Sophie said, at the moment we're using a common, so it's a common constant. So it's very much a broad estimate of carbon.
And a lot of people quite often ask us, a question that we often get is, oh, can you estimate how much carbon would be stored in 10 years, for example? We get that quite a lot, or we get maybe potential partners wanting to know for their net zero policies, would they be able to store this amount of carbon in 10 years? We really can't say, or at the moment, we're looking at developing some research collaboration to try and do predictive modeling over the long term. But right now, all we can say is, based on the data that we currently have, this is how much carbon is being stored in tiny forests, because we don't, as we've discussed here, most data that is described for carbon sequestration is on mature forests. This is part of the reason that we measure these Miyawaki type forests from early growth, to understand the growth dynamics, because that really changes how much carbon is stored over time. And so we really can't predict, for example, how much carbon will be in there in 10 years time, just in case anybody was wondering, because we get that question quite a lot.
And it's a very valid question. We'd love to know the answer. That what will a tiny forest look like in 10, 15, 20 years time is the holy grail. But that's where all of this monitoring will help us understand the process by which forests develop in different situations.
Oh, thanks so much. Thank you. That makes a lot more sense now. Thanks.
Thanks. Any other thoughts or questions? Kath?
Yeah, hi. I'm afraid we didn't do a survey on our forests. It's only a year old, and but just out of curiosity, if tags are lost, do you just do the survey, the measurements on the on say 60 out of the 100 trees, and then you still get a mean measurement, presumably.
Yeah, we say that most forests, if you've had really bad losses of tags and it's below 50%, you can only find, if you had less than 50 tags, we really should look to re-tag and start again. But if you do have over 50, we can get a reasonable estimate from that to extrapolate from. So yeah, keep an eye on it. If you are concerned, give us a call. We do send out sets of tags to re-tag forests that where, bizarrely, we've got one where someone is taking all the tags. It's the weirdest thing, because that would take a lot of time to do. But someone re-tagged a forest 2 weeks ago and contacted us last week to say all the tags have vanished. So it's very surreal. We know some get lost in the mulch, some get blown off in the wind, some get chewed by animals. But to lose all of them is pretty extraordinary.
That's somebody taking offence at the tags, I think.
Maybe, that's very tough deduction.
I was just and from that, it's actually Stephanie's just asked how do you go about downloading the data if you're a tree keeper? So I don't know, Daniel, if you're able to share your screen and we can show you where you find that. So first of all, Stephanie, you need to be registered as a tree keeper, because as an admin, there's a sort of admin access to the data. So you kind of need to be initially registered as a tree keeper, and then you can log in. And when you log in, it will show you the forest that you're a tree keeper for. And then there's an option to download some data. So we'll show you that now. Obviously, as admins, we can access all the forests, which is what you see here, because we're obviously staff. But for yourself, you'll just see the tiny forest that you're a tree keeper for. That could be multiple forests, but if you're just a tree keeper for one, then you'll just see your site. It won't be here like we can see all of them. And so what Daniel's showing here is just at the top of that, once you've logged in as a tree keeper, there's a nice box that says export data. And then that will provide you with a file that has all the different data monitoring outputs for your tiny forest. So it will have a folder. It's got lots of different files within it that will be for carbon, thermal comfort, the 2 different flood infiltration surveys, the 4 different biodiversity surveys, and then some information around setup data that could be useful for your tiny forest as well.
Thank you.
You'll get it definitely just for the forest you are a tree keeper for.
Yes, no, I understand that.
Yeah. If for a research project, or if someone's interested in particular other forests data, we can make that available, but it's not freely downloadable currently. So yeah, if anyone wants any more data, they can request it, and if the request will come through to me and Sophie, we would then deal with that. Yeah. Okay, and just to point to those of you that may be a little bit newer, Lorenzo, you don't need a login to access all the resources. So if you want to see what other surveys we do, there's guides here for all the surveys you were asking about, biodiversity surveys, Lorenzo, and all the other resources that you might need are all on the portal here, and you just access that through the resources tab. If you want to know more about research and our research partners, yeah, that's all in that one. And to find your local tiny forest, everything's mapped here. And if you're off to the Netherlands, go and have a look at some of our forests there.
Yeah, and that's also the way that you will navigate to find, if you're not a registered on here and you're not a registered tree keeper yet, you can still do the surveys. That's the path you go through to get on the survey. So you find the tiny forest site, and then it gives you this option: be a science superhero and take part in monitoring. And then you can do that. So you don't have to be a tree keeper to do the monitoring.
And all the guides again are linked to here, an ID guide for the biodiversity survey. So you can just go to your site and the survey is automatically linked to your particular forest. And there's just a bit of a waiver and a health and safety statement, as unfortunately everyone has to do these days before you get in. But it's a way of keeping you safe and keeping us safe and making sure you understand what you're contributing to. Okay.
Is there any other, does anybody want to discuss, because this doesn't have to be questions around the research, it can be ideas or questions that you have, for example, around what we were talking about, these problems with tagging, or any questions or ideas in general. We're here, it's a safe space.
We won't feel critical vandalised or attacked. We know they're
No. So if anybody else got any other comments or questions they'd like to ask?
I've got a quick question, if that's okay.
Yep.
Obviously, I don't think I'm going to be going to the Knowlesgate farm, like just popping down because it's quite far away. Is there ones like in Manchester that I'm more local to, or ones that are like planned? Like you said, there was like a 60 coming up or something. That is easy to get involved with that aren't through, volunteering days that you could do on the weekends.
There's
or
one
something.
in Crewe. I don't.
Nearer would be, there's one in Wilmslow, but
Oh yeah, I know Wilmslow very well.
I think it's in a school, but
Oh, okay. That's a bit dubious.
never know, depending on the school. There's also two in Birkenhead in Liverpool. It's a bit further away. And I don't have a sight of the list that are coming, the 60 that are coming, I'm afraid.
Right.
But it might be useful, Sophie, if we could get a bit of a message out to current existing tree keepers of a heads up to where things are coming, for the ones we're certain enough about, just to say, oh look, there might be another one in your neighbourhood or friends and family.
Well, I was going to
or on Eventbrite. So if we can manage, we'll get a list put up on Eventbrite of watch this space. There will be ones coming, But yeah, there's Crewe as well. I don't know how close that is to Manchester, but I wouldn't be surprised if there will be ones coming up that way. But like I think where Daniel just navigated to, if you go on the Tiny Forest website, not the Earthwatch one, the Tiny Forest specific one, it shows you where all the tiny forests are in the UK. So you can just see closest to you.
I was going to ask then, sorry, how do you plan for them? How do you identify sites?
Interesting. But there's a whole webinar on it. But in general, it's partnerships with local councils. We have a land manager and a team of project managers who go out, basically making those partnerships with landowners, councils, schools, trying to establish interest, and then we match them up with often corporate funding, some government funded projects, which allow us to put the forest in the ground. But it's quite a process of establishing where's appropriate, where's safe, where you can do the soil excavation, where there aren't utilities under the ground. So there's quite a lot of steps involved before a forest can be put in. And it very much depends on kind of usually local authority enthusiasm or interest. So for instance, Manchester is strangely a big city where we don't have many tiny forests or any in the city itself. And that's mainly because Manchester has already got so many tree plans. They're a city of trees programs. They've got a lot of stuff going on with trees in their urban areas, and they haven't been persuaded that a tiny forest could play a really cool part of their plans.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was or the onus was on us necessarily, or it was in our hands that we could push that or look for things or identify things. If it's I know I live in a local space or I don't, or things like that.
It can go both ways. It can go both ways. We do have people coming forward saying we're really keen to get one, and there's a couple in London, the Hammersmith one, I think, where the local community canvassed their council to have a forest in their area. So it's just a matter of lining up the landowner, and the funding. We can play a role in that, but it make those links. But so yeah, if you're interested or think you have a patch that might be suitable,
not off the top of my head, but it's just something that I was thinking about. If it was as simple as I've got a patch of land that happens to be this size and no one's using it, but I didn't know if it's obviously got to go to the council and stuff like that. And I've got no experience with that. But
all depends on the landowner, but it's always worth starting the conversation.
Always depends on as you saw Christian at Knowlesgate, that one was very different. It's because Glynnis owns the land, who Iski knows. So didn't involve so much local authorities. So yeah, if somebody happens to own land and you know them, that's slightly different. It's just it tends to be on public land like parks and things like that, which is obviously then we go through local authority. But that's what I was saying about in Tiny Forest Project, we have different teams that do different things because so we're a science team, but we have a whole team of people that deal with this kind of logistical planning aspects because it's a lot of work.
And the priority tends to sit around areas of social environmental deprivation. So if you had a suitable plot in a very leafy and wealthy suburb, we'd be potentially limited on the funding that we could apply to that, because our funding might come with a requirement to be using that funding in particular areas.
Yeah.
So Stephanie, you've been patient.
Yes, I keep thinking you're going to pause. Can I ask a question? We're going to do some carbon capture surveying next week.
Brilliant.
And so this is the end of a third growing season for us. We do have some tall trees, so I want to ask a question about measuring tall trees. I listened with interest to the ideas you have, and I know you're going to test them out. But for next week, to be honest, the trees are still quite young and they're quite supple. I was just going to bend them over and use a bit of string. But is that allowed? Am I allowed to touch the trees and manipulate them in that way? They seem quite thin and malleable. So I didn't think that would be an issue, but you didn't mention that at all
that's true.
as an option. So I thought I'd better check.
I definitely did it in the last site I was in, a bit of bending, obviously with care. And
yes.
So you'll be treating them with very tender loving care. So a lot of them will be much more bendy than others.
Yeah.
And so just if you do find it's a bit brittle, don't push it too far. Otherwise, at the moment, we'd be saying, take your mop handle with you, or a long cane, bamboo cane or a garden cane, to help you,
get the height.
And let us know was worked.
Because sometimes they're kind of doing this as well, which is a straight thing or a rigid thing isn't necessarily the best. Anyway. Okay,
I think I agree with Daniel. I think some of them you just know, some of them you can't. Some of them you can easily bend, some you can't. And in terms of measuring with a stick as assistance, I think I know you're probably worried about precision, but I think as long as you can get a relatively close estimate, that's fine. We'd rather have that than it's too tall to measure, because at least it gives us an approximation. Because at the moment I'm analysing the carbon data and I'm trying to decide what I do about those ones, that fairly good section of trees that we've got noted as too tall to measure. I'd rather have it's roughly 7 foot, your stick says plus or minus 10 centimeters, it's 7 foot, than have so
And Stephanie, you were asking about tags before, so if you want to speak to someone before you go out next week, then give us a shout via Divya. She'll put you in touch with us, or she might give questions. But
do you have time for one more question?
We do. Does everyone? We've just gone over time, but either if other people have anything else they want to share, I can stay for another 5-10 minutes.
I've this year set up a friends group for the park where the tiny forest is, partly to look after the tiny forest. But it means that, so it's in a local authority park, council-owned park. We may well plant trees in the park. I was interested to hear that you've got one tiny forest which is flanked by other trees. When we're planning for planting other trees, does it matter how close or far away they are from the tiny forest? And does it matter what kind of things we're planting?
Good question.
Close or not close?
Great questions and really interesting. My initial response would be really interesting to plant some of the same species that we have in the tiny forest in a more traditional way. In terms of more traditional plot, the site we talked about is a little bit unique, and I'm not sure which way. So I don't know what you think, Sophie, of the pros and cons of planting essentially, adjacent to. We just need to, if that's the best place to plant, if there's a logistical reason, that is fine.
We can choose, you see. So I just want to know how much freedom we've got, and is it going to mess anything up? Is it going to enhance things we've close,
My feeling
just so I know.
The most interesting comparison would be if they were not adjacent, not completely adjacent. So they're not each other in terms of shape. To competition.
That's my feeling as well. So when you get so that it would almost be like, if you want to do it in conjunction with us, so we could obviously explore that experimentally as well as providing obviously those resources to your park. It would be great to discuss that, because I agree with Daniel. I think it'd be most interesting if you're going to be willing to collect data on it, to get something slightly a step away, i.e. not butting right up to the tiny forest, that could just be just like 5 meters or something like that. But it's obviously it's very much, it's your land, it's what you're deciding. Ultimately this is your space, but we can have some more conversations around that. And I agree with Daniel, if there's the opportunity to sort of get a crossover in terms of the species mix, that would be super interesting. But yeah,
Okay.
Maybe we can always pick up with another conversation one-to-one.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, Stephanie. It's really exciting to hear. I've been to Very Common twice, and I'm very fond of it because it's an interesting place.
I described it to some people as probably the worst tiny forest in the country because it was very forlorn. It's a bit better now.
It's struggled in its early years, but I'm sure it's benefiting from your love and care.
Yes.
Anyway, we'll probably wrap up unless anyone else has another comment. I mean, for those of you that are newbies, any thoughts or reactions or initial questions? No pressure.
Really appreciate this. Quite often we do these presentations and we don't get any questions or interactions. It's nice that people are there and they're learning, but it's always really wonderful, obviously, when we have a conversation. So thank you to sort of those that have been listening and people that have put things in the chat, and those, hopefully you'll feel more comfortable in future just kind of speaking up and asking questions. There is no such thing.
Did you wave a hand there?
Yeah, I'll just a quick, because I'm new to this. When you tag the people that plant the trees, tag the trees.
Yeah.
Is it at that stage they make a note of the species, presumably?
Yeah, so that's already set up beforehand. So on planting day, we'll have a list of what's being planted, and we'll have a list of how many of each species are getting which tags. So that's immediately set up on the portal straight afterwards. So at the moment, that's the way we've done it that way, because after you've planted the whips, it's very hard in that first year to know what species they are, because there's little sticks and many juvenile trees look very similar. So tagging them at the point when we're planting them, when they come out of a bundle of these are hazel, these are hawthorn, these are rowan, we tag them, then we know what they are. There's obviously sometimes occasions where that's got mixed up, but mainly that sets us up with the right tags on the right species and the right distribution of tags per species, per forest.
So you can't just pick up a tag that's fallen off and attach it to any tree. Hopefully you know which.
No. So if in your first year, so Stephanie, what you were talking about, if you find a tag on the ground and you can go onto the portal and see what species that tag was supposed to be on, look up the number. If you just go into the carbon survey, put the number in and say this is supposed to be on an oak tree. if you know in your forest this first year and no data has been collected on that tag already, you can just pop it on an oak tree. But we can help you with that. If you say, I found this tag, what do I do with it? We can look up and check whether there's been any data, because obviously there has been data collected on that number already. We don't want to move it around trees because then it get very confusing.
But you preferably put it on another oak tree, presumably.
Exactly. You put it on another oak, find out what species it's supposed to be on and put it on that species.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Thanks for the Zoom. Nice to see everybody.
Lovely to see everybody. And good luck with your forests, and hopefully see you again.
Thanks,
everyone.
Cheers.
Quick question, Sophie. When's the deadline for this carbon survey?
Probably another month, okay. Maybe 2 weeks, quite soon, essentially. Yeah.
And it's just once a year, is it?
We do end of year. We do a big monitoring report. So we take all of the kind of data that has been collected during the monitoring season, which is generally sort of late spring to late autumn, and then we put a monitoring report out for people. So we're assuming that most people have more or less done with monitoring their carbon. But if I know that you're going to go out next week, I'm still writing the code at the moment for it. So I would probably say in like 2 weeks approximately, I'd hope to sort of be I'll download a new set of data and run the numbers on that. Okay. But watch this space. We are talking to. Sorry.
If you did do the survey after that point, Kath, the data still goes into next year. It still contributes. It's still baseline people. It just wouldn't. Those numbers wouldn't be represented in the monitoring report, but they would be helpful for you and for your forest for next year and for us for next year's reporting.
And the carbon monitoring itself, is that October, November normally, the end of the year, you say?
We have a specific week called Carbon Week, which is at the end of September. And really that's a focus, just to try to encourage forests, as many forests as possible, to collect their carbon data at the same time, because then we know it's at the end of a growing season. Trees have done most of their growing, but you can collect carbon data at any time during the year.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Right, thanks, folks.
Great to see you.
Cheers. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Alex.
Bye.
Bye.